You're listening to Cornerstone West Los Angeles.
All right, nice to see everybody. We're going to continue through our series in the book of James, and we'll start this morning by reading the passage on which this teaching is based. We're going to be on page 1013 of the Pew Bibles, which is James chapter 4, verses 13 through 17. It'll be on the screen as well. And here's what we'll be working through. Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go into such and such a town and spend a year there and trade and make a profit. Yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring. What is your life? For you are a mist that appears for a little time and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. As it is, you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil. So whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for him it is sin. This is the word of the Lord. Now, we've been going through the book of James for a while now, and what we've seen so far is that what James is trying to do is teach us about living faith. In other words, the kind of faith, the kind of Christianity, the kind of lived relationship with God that is alive and not dead, that's real and not fake, that's genuine and not bogus. And so what we've said is that for people who are not Christians, who are exploring it, what this does that is very helpful for you is it clarifies. There's a lot of things that are sort of passed off as Christian in the world. There's a lot of sort of things that have the reputation of being Christian or not being Christian. What James does is he cuts through all of that noise and says, no, here's what the genuine Christian life looks like. And for those of us who are Christians, we've seen this as a challenge for us. So for us, it's a question of, are we ourselves living the genuine Christian life? Have we taken on other loyalties or priorities or desires and kind of tried to make them Christian to suit our own, ideas? And so what has happened so far, as he's gone through the book, and we've gone through the book, we got to kind of this fulcrum point in chapter 4, where it's come to Jesus moment, where he basically said, look, it's worse than you think in the depths of your heart, and what you need to do, therefore, is humble yourself before God, and he will exalt you. This idea that going to the cross, humbling yourself, and having God be the one that lifts you up, not you lifting up yourself, is a central point for these people who we saw there's a lot of infighting, there's a lot of kind of selfishness, there's a lot of stuff going on amongst this group of people. And so ever since then, what we've done is seen how these people who are supposed to humble themselves, how does that work itself out? So last week, Matt preached through the passage before this, talking about the idea of judging other people. Part of being humble and letting God exalt you is not being judgmental, not putting yourself in the place of God that way. And today, we come to another one of these issues that they need to work out, and therefore so do we. But it's one we wouldn't normally think about as like a top two struggle, and that's planning. So because he hits on planning right now. And yet, if you look closely at it and you think about it a little bit, you see, he's doing something. This is deeper and wider than we probably realize. It's wider in the sense that we don't realize it, but we're always planning. Like you are always planning. Like if you jot down a to-do list, you're planning. If you think about what you're going to do next weekend, you're planning. If you figure out how to tackle a project at work, you're planning. If you figure out how to handle a relationship issue, you're planning. Like, we're always planning in these big and these little ways. So it's wider than we often think. We plan more than we think we do. But it's also deeper, because as much as we're always planning, we almost never ask the question why we're planning or how we're planning. And so James tries to tackle some of that for us this morning. And we can see it a little bit. I mean, just a little bit of questioning that can bring up some really interesting insights. For example, why is it that almost every time you make a plan, you immediately feel a little bit better? What is it about planning that makes you feel better when you're done? The closer you look at it, the more you realize that this is the depth of James, the more you realize that a lot of our planning is us trying to maintain some kind of control in an uncontrollable world. That's almost always what we're doing. Our lives are full of this kind of like anxious planning. So when we don't know what's going to happen next, we immediately start thinking about what we're going to do with it, how we are going to handle it, what steps we're going to take. And at that moment, we think, okay, this is how we'll handle it. This is how it's going to work. The moment we get there, we kind of, we take a deep sigh. It feels a little better. to the degree that we end up with an entire lifestyle of figuring out how we're going to make various things happen in our life. And there's a way of just kind of evaluating your days, looking through your days as just one succession of figuring out what you're going to do about something to the next. It's a whole lifestyle. And we do it, this is the most fascinating thing, we do it even though a significant amount of the time, our plans don't end up working. Like regularly, we make a plan. Again, big things and little things, regularly. We make a plan for here's what we're going to do to kind of control this situation, and it doesn't work. The outcome that we want doesn't happen, and yet we still go back and we never evaluate. We never go, maybe I should plan differently. Nope, we just keep going. Now, we don't usually pay attention to any of this, but James is saying you got to look closer. And here's what he wants to show us. There's this lie that you live by. There's a truth you need to know, and there's a path forward. That's what we're going to do. The lie we live by, the truth we need to know, and the path forward. So first, the lie we live by. He opens up the whole passage with this statement. You who say, today or tomorrow, we will go into such and such a town and spend a year there and trade and make a profit. It sounds like a normal sentence, but the way the whole thing is built, it's meant to show you like how presumptuous all of this is. So today or tomorrow, a day of our choosing, we will go into this or that city, a destination of our choosing. We will spend a year there, a length of time that is of our choosing, and we will carry on business and make money. It will have the results that we choose. The whole thing is built around the idea that we're going to choose who, what, when, why, where, and what's going to happen. Now the problem here, and you got to be careful here. Some people are like, well, you shouldn't plan because of this. No. The problem here isn't that they made a plan. The Bible in a lot of places says planning is very good. So you go to the Proverbs, the idea of being wise with your time and your resources. There are parables Jesus tells about stewardship and investing for the future. Paul talks in the epistles about the days are evil, make the best use of your time. Planning in and of itself is not a bad thing. In fact, it can often be very, very good. The problem here isn't in their planning, it's in their posture. Because what you see there, the entire sentiment is that they are in control of their lives. They're in control of their future. That they can, through their planning, produce the outcome they want. That they can handle life through their own decision making. That through their planning, they can maneuver in the world and produce results of their own choosing. That's the way they're sort of posturing themselves. Now, it's one thing to think wisely about yourself and your life and the future. It's another thing to pretend you're in control of the world and your future. Both lead you to make a plan, but the posture is very different. And James is saying this posture, this is a bigger deal than you think. In verse 16, as it is you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil. It says this kind of planning is evil. It's arrogant. And if you remember last week's passage, so Matt was talking about how when you judge someone else, the problem isn't just that you're like being mean about it. When you condemn someone else, you're not just being like a mean person. The problem is that you're standing in God's place. You're acting as though you're God. Here's God over here, and everyone's accountable to God, and you're looking at this person saying, no, you're accountable to me. That's the problem with being judgmental in the way that James talked about last week. But today the theme continues. A lot of the time, when you plan in big or little ways, the problem isn't just that you happen to be a little too certain about it. The problem is that you're acting as though you're God. You're saying, no. The world, the future, these situations, they're accountable to me. And that does something for us. It satisfies something in us. There's it's called the J.B. Phillips translation. This guy did it a long time ago. But he translated this verse. You get a certain pride in yourself when you plan your future with such confidence. And isn't that true? Isn't there a kind of rush? You can't, when you make a plan, when you chart out what you're going to do to handle a problem or meet a goal or take a step forward in life, where does that rush come from? James says, no, it's pride. It's arrogance. There's a sense of control that you like, that feels good. Where you don't recognize how little you are in control of your life, but instead just kind of deny that. You think that all your future is due to you and your planning. You think you're on top of things. That's part of the appeal of planning in the first place, isn't it? How often do you plan thinking to yourself, how can I best love God and love people with my schedule this week? How much more often is it, how can I just get stuff done and take care of my business and organize my life this week? It's almost never about God and others. It's almost entirely about you and your ownership of how things are going to go for you. It's a fast, and we get a rush from it, don't we? It feels good. Like, make that to-do list. Like, check that thing off to feel like you're captaining your own ship, you know? You're on top of things. And he says we boast in this. A lot of that in the Bible is an internal kind of a thing. It's a I'm placing confidence and stock in this. This is what makes me kind of good or important. But sometimes this is literal outside boasting too. Like, we're still in January. Like, the wild, wild west of the internet is full of an entire domain of social media that's basically about how awesome you planned for 2020. Like, I've got words for each month. You know, and here, I got productivity gurus who are going to tell you, here's how you can, like, nail it this year. Don't do that, do this. Don't plan this way, plan this way. Buy this thing, and that'll help you plan. And there's this way that all of a sudden everyone else starts doing it. It's like, yeah, let me post about how my awesome plans are. And there's never a sense of if to it. There's never a, like, well, if this happens. No, it's when. Because that's what planning does. It produces a when. It gives me confidence over what my life is going to be like. And I'm in control of that confidence when I do things the right way. But for most of us, I think, it's less overt than that. It takes all kinds to make a world. There's plenty of us in here who are doing that sort of a thing. But for most of us, it's not this overt, in-your-face sort of, here's how I'm planning my life. You see it much more in just the way you take your control over your life for granted. It's just assumed that the things you choose, the things you do, are going to determine the outcomes in your life. And so you kind of go through life, you just assume everything's going to keep on moving the way you want it to move, the way it sort of has moved in the past, as though that's something due us or owed to us, or that we get it somehow through our knowledge or our technology or our good choices or whatever, can make that work. Like, do you have that kind of awareness that in a split second, like, everything could change? It's fascinating. Like, we know people. Like, not like people out, on TV or something. There are people that we know, you personally know, for whom that's happened. In a split second, in big or little ways, everything's changed. A whole day went sideways. A whole life went sideways. And we still just take for granted that we're in control of all of this. Is there a way that, it's not that you have to go around and say, well, I'm super awesome and confident, I'll make my plans. You also can succumb to this sort of arrogance by just not living your life with a sense that what happens isn't just yours to decide. By living your life with the idea that whatever happens in the future is your choice. It's a result of what you planned. It's just you take it for granted. So the ultimate problem, you put all this together, the ultimate problem is we end up living without any reference to God. Our life is just our own. There's no sense in which he's a part of it in any substantive sort of way, such that our plans would reflect that at all. Which means we're making ourselves out to be God. Anytime he's absent, that's what ends up happening. Whether we're constantly planning or just taking our control over the future for granted. And that's the lie we live on. That's the lie that shapes more of our life than we realize, more of your life than you realize. That you control your own life. That's the lie we live on. That you have authority over what happens in your life. That you are the biggest influence over your future. Now, what's the truth? James goes on in verse 14. He says, yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring. What is your life? For you are a mist that appears for a little time and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. Now, what he's basically saying is the truth of the matter is you actually don't have any of this kind of control. That's not, and that the Lord is the one who actually does. And you see this all over the Bible. It's everywhere. James pulls a lot from Jesus, his brother. And so Jesus told a parable once about a guy, essentially an agriculture farmer guy, and he said he had a bumper crop. He says, I'm going to build these sort of silos. I'm going to store all the grain in there, and then I've got these plans for how I'm going to live the rest of my life. And the answer to that was, you fool. You don't know this very night your life will be demanded of you. And what will happen to all of this wealth you've amassed up? In other words, there's ways in which you can plan and plan and plan, and yet you're not in control of what comes next. Things can go sideways very quickly. This week was, I can't remember what anniversary it was, of the Northridge earthquake, decades ago. So the Northridge earthquake happened, however many years ago, this last week. And what's crazy about thinking about that kind of earthquake is that while there weren't that many deaths, there were untold millions of disrupted plans. Some of them were a lot more important than others. But like everyone that day woke up, maybe not having their to-do list all written out, but they had this sense, here's what's going to happen for me today. Here's what I'm going to do. Maybe I'll go there next. Maybe I'll have this conversation next. There's a plan in place, and it could have been the perfect plan to produce whatever outcomes they wanted. But it didn't matter because there was a giant earthquake. You're not in control of these sorts of things. From big earthquakes to little metaphorical earthquakes, things go sideways really fast. And you can't, even in the book of Proverbs. So this week, I went to the book of Proverbs, like, I got to find some stuff that's like positive about planning for that first part you heard earlier. So I go to Proverbs, and I search for the word plan, which is a pastor trick, Google. And I search for plan in Proverbs. And so I found all the times the word plan shows up in Proverbs in our translation. And what was fascinating was almost every time in Proverbs, you get a verse about how we actually can't plan that well. In Proverbs, the book about wisdom and like thinking about the future and stuff. Like, it was like, you can't do it. Listen, Proverbs 16:9. The heart of man plans his way, but the Lord establishes his steps. Proverbs 16:3. Commit your work to the Lord, and your plans will be established. Proverbs 19:21. Many are the plans in the mind of a man, but it is the purpose of the Lord that will stand. Even in Proverbs, it's like, you're not good at this. This isn't your thing. Like, you can't really convert on the things you want to happen. It's just not. Now, why is that true? And the Bible would say, and frankly just experience would say, that it's tied up in the kind of creature we are. Like, we aren't the kind of creature that can make sure things happen when we want them to. In the verse, what you see, it's actually kind of lost in the translation a little bit. But the idea of like, what is your life, is meant to communicate not like, wasn't your life short, but like, no, like, what kind of thing do you think you are? Like, do you think you and I are the kind of thing that has that level of control over the world around us and our own lives? Like, that's not the kind of thing you are. It's not the kind of creature you are. You're a human. That means you're finite. You're limited. You're constrained. Like, you can't reach out into the world and like make things happen the way God can, like speaking things into existence, or the way we do it, planning things into existence. That's not something you can do. And he talks about us being like, therefore, a mist that's around a little bit and vanishes, which normally in the Bible means like transitory, like a mist kind of shows up. It's temporary, kind of like, you live a long life, but it's kind of like, it's really quick in that sense. But it also, in the Bible, can be used to talk about how powerless things are. Like, a mist isn't strong. Like when fog rolls in, no one's ever said, like, I hope it doesn't damage any buildings. He's like, no, that's not a problem. The fog it won't damage anything. And there's ways, cars cut through fog, and like a quick shift in wind will move the mist, and the sun comes out, and it takes a couple of minutes, and that little mist, the morning mist, is just gone. The idea is like, that's the kind of thing we are. It just is. And so you see, like, to think about the plans you're making right now, like the little ones, the big ones, the short-term ones, the long-term ones, you realize quickly that, like, you and I, we just aren't the sort of thing that can control what happens. Like, the wind can shift at any time. And so you begin to see, like, the pride, the strange sort of irrationality of acting like you can control this stuff, of like sitting down to make the plan that's going to like change things, that's going to, assert your control over the world. And what ends up happening when you mix the truth of our situation, that we're not in control but God is, with the lie that we tell ourselves and we live on, that we really are in control, what gets produced is a lot of pride and a lot of anxiety. Pride, which we discussed, above, there's a sense in which when you start thinking you can control things and things happen to work out the way you wanted, you end up feeling like, like I'm doing pretty good. I remember there's junior high kids who they're on a basketball team, and they were going to play this really good basketball team at another junior high. Who knew the nationally ranked junior high teams? But that was like one of those things. Like, scouts are looking at this team, and the other team was coming to play them. So they were very worried, but they got home court advantage. Well, the other team's bus broke down, so they had to forfeit. And these kids bragged about how they won. They're like we beat that team. Like they were like we beat it because on the stat sheet, technically that was a win, like for them. It's like no, they're a bus. It's different. Like just because you beat them technically doesn't mean you actually beat them in basketball. And we do a lot of the same thing when we plan and things go well. We're like, hey, we did it. Like no, their bus broke down. Like you're standing on the shoulders of something else, looking around, going like, look how awesome I am. That's not how this works, but that's what it creates in us when it goes well. We become those people who brag as though we did something when we kind of didn't. It just worked out. We contributed a little, but not, And then there's also anxiety under that. There's an awful anxiety and insecurity, and it can be, honestly, a little bit traumatic because when you think you're in control, and then the truth asserts itself, and you realize when the wind shifts, and you kind of experience your missedness, all of a sudden the floor drops out from under you and you're surprised and you don't know what happened and you're freaking out. And what do? You make a different plan. And then it happens again. And then you make more plans and it becomes a lifestyle and a personality. And you end up on this sort of hamster wheel of pride and insecurity and anxiety, all because you're living your life based on this lie and you're not really willing to understand the truth, even though, frankly, is there anything more obvious than the fact that we aren't fully in control of what happens in the world or in our own lives? It's fascinating to me that that's something that we have to make a point of saying to each other. Is there anything more empirically provable than that we aren't actually in control of the things that happen? And yet here we are having to look at each other. You see what we've done? We've all just built this lifestyle of denial and a culture of denial. So we all are telling each other, no, tweak the plan, it'll work out. And now we have to explain to each other about the normal baseline realities of existence and make them into TED Talks and stuff. Like, guys, you're not actually in control. Whoa! It's just fascinating that we have to do this. But we do, and I need to hear it, and so do you. We've worked this thing up. So of course, you see, when that's the situation you find yourself in, of course it produces pride when it goes well, and anger and fear and frustration and anxiety when it doesn't. And you can see both, you can hear how they sound in verse 13, in these guys, these sort of hypothetical people who were saying this sentence. Like, coming off of a great business year, this sounds really confident and maybe arrogant. We're going to this town next, do a year, make some more money. It's like, we're going to do this, we're going to get it done. Coming off of a really disastrous year, it sounds like convincing yourself. It sounds like insecurity. Here's how we're going to stay afloat. We're going to go to such and such a town. We're going to stay there for a year, do some business, make some money. Same thing, because they're both in there. That's how anxious planning works. You're either proud or you're insecure. And by trying to take this sort of total control through your planning, you're setting yourself up for more of that. Every time you do your own kind of anxious planning, you're just setting yourself up for either false pride or insecurity. You're making the hamster wheel go faster in your own life. Because the unknown of the future says, you see the unknown, you say, I want to take control. And that means you have to then stay in control, doesn't it? And prove your control. If you ever want to step away from anxiety and worry, you got to prove it, but that just gives more into your plate. Think about how many ways that you agonize over decisions. I'll just do the big ones, not the little ones. The little ones are maybe worse because there's so many, but just the big ones. You agonize over them, not because you're looking to love and serve others out of a place of firm foundation in your life, but because that you think if you do it right, you'll have control over the outcome. Like what your major will be in college, what career path you're going to take, who you're going to marry, what friends you should spend more time with, what kind of job you should take, whether you should move jobs from one to the other, where you should move geographically. That's just the big ones. And the amount of time we spend planning, thinking, pro-con sheeting, figuring it out as though we have this amazing control over the outcome. Not because we want to love other people, but because we're scared. Because we're anxious. Because a plan might help that. It's amazing the amount of agony we put ourselves through. All because we forgot something that's absolutely obvious. And James says, what you have to see is not just that you're not in control. You have to also see, if you want to get out of this, that the Lord is. There's no way out apart from this. He says, that's verse 15. He says, what you got to say is, if the Lord wills will live and do, this or that. And that's a theme also throughout the Bible. Just as an example, Psalm 30, verses 10 through 11. The Lord brings the counsel of the nations to nothing. He frustrates the plans of the peoples. The counsel of the Lord stands forever, the plans of his heart to all generations. In other words, there's only one person whose plans actually happen exactly as intended every time forever, and that's God, and not you. And in that way, now what's most fascinating to me about this is that James is writing here to Christian people. They know that God is strong and sovereign and powerful and big, and they know that God demands their worship and ownership over all of their life, and that they should serve him and love him. They know that stuff, and they're still living without reference to him. He's not saying, oh, you guys, now I know you're saying if the Lord wills a lot, but you really should think about it more. No, he's saying you guys should start saying this. Why don't Christians say, if it's the Lord's will, we'll do this or that? Why don't Christians live as though their life is a mist? When this is what we say we believe, but we don't live this way. What's going on? It's because underneath all of this, we are not just anxious. We don't just want control because we're anxious about being out of control. Even as Christians, we're also anxious about who is in control. And that's the dagger. The dagger is that when James says, the Lord is in charge, we don't immediately say, oh, good. Almost always we bristle. Immediately, James says the Lord's will is the answer, and we say, no, the Lord's will is the problem. Because that's why I'm planning. What if the Lord's will doesn't have things go the way I want them to go? That's why I have to plan. I've got to get some sort of end run around him to make this thing work. I've got to get some kind of purchase on my own life. I can't just let him do this, because we're kind of anxious about what he's going to do. Even as Christians, just knowing you're out of control isn't it. Knowing the Lord is in control actually does make you maybe even a little more scared sometimes. What's he going to do? When I was first installing car seats in a car, a storied history of which I have much experience now, I saw they have these attachments, the front-facing seats, not when it's a baby, but like a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old, so they can face forward in the car in the back seat. And there's attachments that are pretty realistic-looking steering wheels with horns and sometimes like a hand shifter on the side. And it's a toy. But in the sort of promotion for this product, you have this idea that the kids actually think they're driving the car. So they're walking, oh, and the car turns, and the car turns that way, and the car turns. And towards the end, they realize that it's not working, that they're not actually driving the car. And they sort of get bummer, oh no. And of course, it's a toy, and they have fun, they honk the horn a little more, and the ad's over. It's sort of a little bit. What's fascinating is that there's an interesting difference between a kid who realizes they're not driving the car and says, bummer, and then kind of plays, okay, I guess, we'll go wherever we're going. And a kid that realizes they're not driving the car and starts to cry and sob and have a tantrum and get anxious and try and unbuckle. And the only real difference between those two kids is how much they actually trust the person who is driving. If you trust the person driving, it's it's too bad, all right. If you don't trust the person driving, it's a traumatic experience because you don't feel safe. And the problem with being a kid is you're strapped in. It's hard to get those buckles undone, I know. And there's really no way out because there is a 0% chance that you're ever going to attach that plastic, driving steering wheel to the drive shaft of the car you're in. So you're just stuck on this kind of horror ride of wondering what's going to happen. And that's sometimes how we feel when we find out that God's the one driving, the car of life and the world. What's going to happen? And sometimes we coach ourselves into feeling okay about it, and other times we just freak out and we try and get the steering wheel attached. We try and unbuckle, jump and roll. There's these things we try and do to plan our way out of the situation we're in. Is there some way maybe I can get him to turn the way I want if I say the right things. There's all these things we do. Because we just, deep down, ultimately don't trust him. We're worried about God's driving, but we're stuck. So we pretend and deny. We plan and plan. We try and find ways to have some control. We as Christians don't say, if the Lord's wills. We say, he has his will and I have mine, and then we're going to work to make those things the same. But I want him to be the one that adjusts. Now, this is what happens in verse 17. Where he says, so whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for him it is sin. It's a fascinating verse, especially for Christians, because what it means is you can't just avoid doing bad things. Okay, I didn't break any commandments today, or I don't know, the ones that I think matter. I didn't break any of those. So now you have to leave me alone and let me live my life. It's not the kind of thing where if I avoid doing a few things, you give me the rest of my life to work with. James is saying, no, it's not, okay, I can do whatever I want as long as I don't do something bad. God has a claim over what you leave undone, too. It's like all of your actions, all of yourself is built to follow God. Not just what you don't do, but what you do as well. Not just what you do, but what you leave undone as well. The whole thing, all your choices, all your responses, everything is built. You can't get any space on him to say, but this part I control. But we try and do it all the time. And James points out, he says, no, that's called sin. That's a sinful thing you're doing. And James says, right in that moment, when he comes to us and say, and we see this in the rest of the book as well and before it, but even here, he says, you don't think you want God to be in control, but it's exactly what you want. It's exactly what you need. You just have to see it. You have to see it. And that's why he says, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we'll do such and such. He says, here's how life's supposed to work. Here's what is right. For James, it's not just, you shouldn't just say, if the Lord wills, because that's just sort of correct. It's also because that's how you want it to be. And there's a couple of ways to see that, to kind of warm the heart. One of them is just in the book of James as a whole. What has he said so far about God? This is the kind of God who exalts the humble. That when you're at your most broken down, he's the one who picks you up. It doesn't make you pick yourself up. That's a good God to drive. Or even here, just the very fact, if it's God's will. You know what that means? That means he pays attention to us. How often have you walked down the street and had a will for the ant you saw in the periphery of your eye on the concrete? Very rarely, I would say, did you have a set will for that ant. Why? Because you don't care. That ant can do whatever he wants. Go nuts, ant. Find a grain of food. You don't care. It doesn't matter to you. And here comes God. Here comes James saying, this is the God that we have. He takes interest in you. He takes thought for you, the Psalms say. There's parts in the Psalms where he says he stores up your tears in his bottle. He owns a bottle and puts your tears in it to remember them, to make sure they don't go unanswered. That's a fascinating amount. There's a tenderness to that and a love to that that's real and dynamic and makes you wonder if it isn't a good thing that he's in control and you're not. Maybe that kind of God should be the one that drives. But the thing that James always goes back to, and it runs throughout it's underground for the whole book. It's like an underground river underneath the whole book of James, is his experience and understanding of his brother, Jesus. Half-brother. Because what happens is you see James pulling from his sermons, pulling from his statements, pulling from these gospel accounts. Even here, you have this allusion to when Jesus says, hey, consider the lilies of the field. God takes real good care of them, and he loves you and thinks you're even more important, so he'll take care of you too. Don't be anxious. There's an allusion to these things here. But all those allusions always point to the same thing. And that's that the Lord's will is the kind of thing that God will only ever use for my good. And that can be hard to believe. That's what the Bible says. And often, if you look through the Bible, you have this sort of theme of God's control and God's will, and sort of evolves and grows. And in the beginning, it's very assertive in a sense. So he speaks things into being, and it immediately happens. And there's a division of things in the world, and there's a kind of creation of peoples and moving geopolitical things around, and also talking to individuals and setting plans in place. It's very clear how he's moving things along, and how his power and control is evident. The Lord's will is happening. And then you get these also interesting hints as you get later. They're not very pronounced, but they're there, where there's a sense in which, as God talks about saving his people, there's going to be a way in which he uses his will in a way that is somehow damaging to to himself, or at the very least damaging to the Lord who appears. So you got the Lord, and then the Lord comes, and the Lord is like damaging the Lord through his will. So here's Isaiah 53:10. It was the will of the Lord to crush the coming Messiah. So now this sort of powerful will is being used to crush the one who deserves no crushing and the one who is God somehow. It's kind of confusing in the Old Testament. And then you find Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane just before he's crucified, and he's praying. And he says, Father, if there's any way this cup, and by the cup he means, the wrath of God for our sins, for mine and for yours and for other people's, if there's any way this cup could pass from me. He says, yet not my will, but your will. And what you have here in this fascinating Trinitarian relation, you have God the Son recognizing the plan, the goodness of the plan, of the will that God the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit put together before the foundations of the world to have him suffer. Not my will, but your will. And by the time you get to Ephesians chapter 1, which is later on in the Bible, you have Paul, I won't read the whole thing, but you have Paul talking about how before the foundations of the world, this plan was set in motion. That the entirety of existence has been one where God has leveraged his control that you don't have and you think you want. He's leveraged his control to his own hurt to bring himself glory and bring you home. And I don't want him to drive. It doesn't make a lot of sense. When you see it, do you see what happens when you see it? If you anchor yourself in this, you begin to see that. And what does it produce? Does it produce pride and anxiety? No, it makes you realize how foolish it is to not want him to drive. Why in the world would you be anxious about what he's going to do when you realize, even when you don't understand things, you look at Jesus where the darkest hour was the one in which the greatest things were happening for all of eternity, and you go, okay, I at least have to sort of slow my roll and thinking I know exactly what's going on now. There's a way in which this kind of approach to life, you stop white-knuckling things and you start looking at your plans and the world and God very differently. And it produces security where there was insecurity, because you can make bad plans that will hurt you, but you know he never will. If he crucified his son for you, he's not now going to turn around and make plans that are the worst thing that could happen to you. And even then, you have to see what are we afraid is going to happen to us? The thing you're the most afraid is going to happen to you. And the reason you plan anxiously, the reason you do anxious planning is because you're afraid the things that are going to happen to you are bad things. The things you're afraid are going to happen to you happened worse to Jesus as he used his control to save you. There is no limit to the layers of the grace and the love that he has. We should be okay with him being Lord. We should be, thankful. And when you see the gospel like that, it does that thing where it kind of melts you and reforms you, and you undig your heels a little and you kind of reassess and realize that was a foolish way to live. And that's where James gives us this path forward. Well, first, just to sum up, you caught the truth, right? The truth was that we're not in control, but God is, and that's the only way to peace. That's the only way to get off the hamster wheel of all this. The wheel you don't even know you're on, but you're on. And finally, there's this path forward. And it's this one verse, in verse 15, he says, here's what you ought to say. If the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. A couple things to notice here in figuring out, so what do you do now? How do you leave? What do you do with this? This is still planning. Like that, they're still saying it's a more truncated plan. It's a little less like, yeah, we're going to go here and then do this and for this long. It's a little more like, well, we're going to be alive, we think, and we're going to do this or this. There's a humility to it, but it's still a plan. And so what we're seeing is there's two kinds of planning. Like some of you, when you get overwhelmed, you don't run to planning. You run away from planning. You just go do nothing. Okay, you should plan more. Like that's a thing. But others of us, and maybe a lot of us, we run to planning in those times. And James says, no, there's two kinds of planning. There's a kind of planning you want to do, whether you're a planner or not. And that's like wise, humble planning. And then there's the kind of planning you don't want to do, which is anxious, controlling planning. And he says the big difference is your awareness of the Lord's will in the mix of your planning. And that means at least a couple of things. One, it means that you have to recognize the Lord's will is bigger than your will when you plan. And second, you have to realize the Lord's will is better than your will when you plan. And if you can hold those two things in your mind as you plan and in your heart, you're going to find yourself making wise, humble plans, not anxious, insecure, controlling plans. Now, what does that mean? Well, first, you recognize the Lord's will is bigger than your will. That's the way this kind of planning is set up. It's sort of always aware, clearly, that the reality is that God is in control while you're not. So you can make your plans, but if it's his will, it's going to happen. If it's not, you plan as much as you want, it's not going to happen. And that changes the way you plan, even if it doesn't change the plans themselves. Because notice, it says, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. The this or that is pretty broad, right? You can put a lot of stuff inside this or that. In fact, you could put going to a certain town, spending a year there, and doing some business. In other words, the plans themselves might not change, but the way this stands, the way this is stated, it's a chastened kind of planning. It's a humble kind of planning. Because it's aware that no matter what I'm planning to do, God's will is bigger than mine. And that slows down the amount of sort of controlling planning that you do. And that means that maybe what we ought to do is have a kind of spiritual discipline of saying, if the Lord wills. You don't have to say it, I suppose. Some people say it a lot. Or they use the Latin, Deo volente, if the Lord wills. There's old documents you might find with DV on the bottom. Bach wrote those sometimes, DV, or Soli Deo Gloria, to God be the glory. You have these different ways of articulating this, but you have to think it inside. And at some point, maybe it's not just about when you plan, but also that spiritual discipline of maybe it's at night before you go to sleep, you think about tomorrow. You just think for a while about all the ways that the things you think are going to happen tomorrow might not happen. I do this sometimes. Like there could be an earthquake. That's a big one. It's a little traumatic. But there's all sorts of ways. There could be traffic. There's all these things that could get in the way of the things that I'm planning on doing tomorrow. And at that point, it puts you in kind of a humble frame of mind as you think about what you're going to do. Like, how many ways could this fall apart? There's a spiritual discipline in that. I'm just realizing I'm small. I'm not in control of all of this. But I should probably make a humble plan anyway. So you have to think about the way that God's will is bigger. But second, you have to realize God's will is better than your will. And that's always true in the Bible. It's almost never just about how much bigger God is in terms of control than you, but how much better it is for you that he's in control. You see it in the Lord's Prayer. Right? Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. This idea is that it's very starkly like, not your will, his will be done on earth as it is in heaven, because that's better for you. You should pray for that. You should want that, is what Jesus is saying. And it's the same here. To say, if it's the Lord's will, is not just sort of this like gritted teeth, well, I hate it, it frustrates me, and I wish I was in control, but I guess he is, so if it's the Lord's will, that's clearly not what he's going for. It's more along the lines of submission. Like, I'm submitting to the fact that it's the Lord's will. I'm desirous of this. Saying if the Lord wills means these plans depend on the Lord, on what the Lord who loves me and knows me best will do. And so that spiritual discipline fits in here too. If you constantly think about all the ways things could not happen that you had planned, one of the things you're going to realize very quickly is how often those things don't happen. And things do kind of go off the way you were hoping they would. Which means that while you have been like really arrogant in just assuming you're in control of your life, God has still kept all those things happening in your life. He hasn't pulled the rug out from under you and been like, see, you weren't really in control the whole time anyway. There's so many ways, like day to day, he's been just so kind to let you, even when you're being arrogant, continue to not have your whole life go sideways every day to prove a point. It's an amazing, you see his love for you in these sorts of things. But more than that, the best spiritual discipline is this. There are going to be times when a decision comes your way. And it probably is an anxiety-inducing decision. And when that happens, your knee-jerk reaction, the thing you have done almost every day of your life, is you have coped with the uncertainty of what comes next by running to strategy. I don't feel comfortable here. I feel uncertain. I'm going to go plan. I'm going to get my head around it. We can call it processing. You can call it lots of things. I'm going to go do this thing where I'm going to figure it out. Now, what James is saying here, and probably the biggest spiritual discipline you can have, when anxiety comes along, when a decision comes along, don't run to your planning. Run to Jesus. If what you need is how to organize your life and be wise and loving to other people, that planning is great for that. If what you need is security and confidence in the future, planning is horrible at that. But Jesus is not. And it's when you run to him and you anchor your life with him and you say, Jesus, I am very uncomfortable because I am uncertain about the future and I feel like I am out of control. It's when you run to him and he says, I'm in control. And it might not go the way you think, but I will always take care of you. You can always trust me because I will always love you. It's from there you can start making a pretty good plan about what to do next. That's secure and anchored, not in how well you're going to perform, but in the God who performed for you, and the one who saved you, and the one who exalts the humble. And what that's going to do, if you look, is going to create a fascinating kind of life for you. The world is very freaked out. I mean, right now in general, but like always in general too, like people are freaked out. There's a lot of uncertainty, like in individual lives, in social lives, in political lives, in corporate lives. There's a lot of like, I don't know what's going to happen. People freak out a lot. And it would be pretty amazing if we became the kind of people who lived a sort of if the Lord wills lifestyle, such that at work and at home and in the neighborhood, we became this kind of attractive place where people said, you don't seem to be anxiously planning a lot, but you do seem to be kind of confident and secure. And we begin to be the kind of place that the church is called to be, the kind of Christians James wants us to be, living the genuine Christian life, where that gospel works itself out, not just in a few things we do or don't do, but in the way we look at the world, the way we look at our future, the way we handle our uncertainties. We go to Jesus before we go to planning. Let's pray.
Thank you for listening to Cornerstone West Los Angeles. For more information, please visit us on the web at cornerstonewla.org.